There are places in America where the silence is so complete that you can hear a screen door close from half a mile away, where the nearest neighbor is a smear of yellow kitchen light through a stand of old sycamores, where life moves in seasons, planting, growing, harvest, stillness. Carroll County, Indiana, in the autumn of 1997 was exactly that kind of place. Flat, quiet, and to those who lived there, entirely predictable. And then, on the morning of October 14th, 1997, a little girl named Molly Ann Dreiser did not come downstairs for breakfast. She was 7 years old. She had brown hair that she wore in 2 braids. She liked strawberry jam on white toast, and she always woke before her parents. Her mother, Diane Dreiser, told investigators that in 7 years of mornings, Molly had never once needed to be called to the table. So when Diane climbed the stairs at 7:22 a.m. and found the bed empty, the sheets pulled back, and the window overlooking the back field standing open just 4 inches in the October chill, she said she felt something shift inside her chest. Not panic. Not yet. Something quieter and more terrible, the sensation of a world that had already changed without asking her permission. The toy truck Molly had been playing with the evening before lay on its side near the door. The swing set in the backyard hung absolutely still in windless air, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a crow called once, then went silent. Who opened that window and why would not be answered for nearly 22 years. To understand what happened in Carroll County in October of 1997, you first have to understand the Dreisers. Gary Dreiser was 34 years old. He worked the second shift at the grain elevator in Delphi, a job he had held for 9 years without complaint. His coworkers described him as steady, reliable, a man of few words who remembered your birthday and your coffee order and never once asked for anything in return. He drove a 1991 Ford pickup, dark green, with a cracked side mirror he kept meaning to fix. He coached Molly's Pee-wee soccer team on Saturdays. He grilled on Sunday evenings, even in September when the evenings turned cool. He was, in every visible way, a good man. Diane Dreiser, 31, taught second grade at Rossville Elementary, 20 minutes south on State Road 25. She was the kind of teacher parents requested by name. She kept a garden in the backyard, tomatoes, zucchini, marigolds along the fence, and she was known in her neighborhood as the woman who always had extra zucchini and always remembered to ask how your mother was doing. She and Gary had been married 8 years. They had Molly, and by all appearances, a life that was quietly but genuinely good. The morning of October 14th began the way most Tuesday mornings began in the Dreiser household. Gary had worked until 11 the previous night and was still asleep when Diane came downstairs at 6:50 a.m. She started the coffee, fed the dog, a beagle named Herschel, and set out 2 plates. She assumed Molly would appear any moment, as she always did, still in her pajamas, hair uncombed, dragging her stuffed rabbit by one fraying ear. By 7:10, Molly had not appeared. Diane climbed the stairs at 7:22 a.m. She pushed open the door to Molly's room and saw the empty bed, the window ajar, the silence where a child should have been. She called Molly's name once, then again. Then she went and woke Gary. What happened in the next 12 minutes is both well documented and, in retrospect, deeply significant. Gary did not rush downstairs. He did not run outside. He sat on the edge of the bed for what Diane later estimated was 2 full minutes before he spoke. He said, "She probably went out to see the deer." There had been a family of white-tailed deer grazing in the back field the previous evening, and Molly had been fascinated by them, pressing her face to the kitchen window until her breath fogged the glass. It was a reasonable thing to say. Gary did not run to the back door and called Molly's name across the empty field. Diane, already dialing her own mother, watched him from the kitchen window. She noticed that he stood very still, hands in his pockets, looking at the tree line. Later she would return to that image many times, the stillness of him, the hands in the pockets, not searching, just watching. Carroll County Dispatch received Diane's call at 7:43 a.m., 21 minutes after she first found the empty room. By 8:15, the first deputy had arrived. By 9:00 a.m., the yard was cordoned and Molly Ann Dreiser was officially listed as a missing child. The toy truck lay on its side by the door. The swing hung still, and the window stood open 4 inches, letting in air that smelled of dead leaves and turned earth and the particular cold that comes to Indiana in the second week of October, when summer has been over long enough that you've stopped grieving it. Within 48 hours, Carroll County had mounted one of the largest coordinated searches in its recorded history. The Carroll County Sheriff's Department, the Indiana State Police, the Delphi Volunteer Fire Department, and nearly 400 civilian volunteers fanned out across the corn stubble and creek bottoms east and south of the Dreiser property. K-9 units worked the tree line. Helicopters swept the fields. Dive teams checked the retention pond 3/4 of a mile northeast, a murky body of water surrounded by willow trees that local teenagers used for fishing, and that, in those first cold hours, seemed to hold some terrible possibility. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a fiber, not a single identifiable trace that Molly Dreiser had ever moved beyond the perimeter of her own backyard. The community responded with the particular fierce solidarity of small American towns that have never had to do this before. Churches organized meal rotations for the Dreisers. The Delphi Banner ran Molly's photograph above the fold every day for 2 weeks, brown braids, a gap-toothed smile, a purple sweatshirt she'd been photographed in at a school picture day 3 weeks before she vanished. People drove from as far as Lafayette and Logansport to walk in the search lines, wearing orange vests and carrying flashlights into woodlots they had never entered before. And through all of it, Gary Dreiser was present. He stood in the command tent and he answered questions, and he wore the face of a grieving father, the reddened eyes, the jaw held too tight, the way he would sometimes stop mid-sentence as though the words had run out. He held Diane's hand at the press conference on October 16th. He wept, or appeared to weep, when the Carroll County Sheriff read a statement appealing for any information from the public. But there were things, small things, the kind that don't mean anything on their own but that accumulate one by one like stones placed on a scale. Clear's throat. Those who knew him said Gary seemed oddly composed in the private moments, the moments between the cameras and the press statements, when the grief was supposed to show itself honestly. A deputy who was present in the Dreiser kitchen on the morning of the disappearance noted in his report that Gary drank 2 full cups of coffee before anyone from the search team arrived, that he commented on the weather, that he asked, at one point, whether anyone wanted toast. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the timing. Gary had arrived home from the grain elevator at 11:17 p.m. on the night of October 13th, confirmed by the facility's sign-out log. The family home was 14 miles from the elevator. His truck's odometer, photographed by investigators on October 15th as part of routine documentation, showed 847 more miles than it had at the last oil change 6 weeks prior. The oil change receipt, still tucked in the glove box, had been dated September 2nd. In 6 weeks of driving to and from work on a 14-mile route, roughly 560 miles, accounting for normal variation, the discrepancy was nearly 300 miles. Investigators noted it. They could not explain it. They did not yet know what it meant. The window in Molly's room presented its own questions. The screen had been removed from the outside and leaned against the exterior wall, below the sill, where it could not be seen from the backyard. A child could have removed a screen from inside, but this screen showed no marks on the interior frame, no smudging of the rubber gasket consistent with small fingers pushing outward. The marks on the frame, a forensic technician from the state lab would later note in a preliminary report, were consistent with removal from the exterior. But the window was 8 feet off the ground. A ladder would have been necessary. No ladder was found. Herschel the beagle had not barked. 3 neighbors whose properties abutted the Dreiser land confirmed they had heard nothing unusual between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. A dog that did not bark is not, by itself, evidence of anything. But it is a detail that sits strangely, and investigators knew it. By mid-November, the search had formally contracted. The dive teams were recalled. The volunteer lines disbanded. The helicopters stopped. The Carroll County Sheriff's Department assigned the case to a detective named Raymond Ellsworth, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for patience and a desk covered in case files he was known never to let go of entirely. Ellsworth spoke to Gary Dreiser 4 times over the following 6 months. He spoke to Diane 8 times. He interviewed 41 community members, 3 grain elevator employees, and 1 individual, a part-time farmhand named Douglas Hatt who had worked briefly on a property adjoining the Dreisers, who seemed briefly like a possibility, until an airtight alibi and a verifiable cell phone record removed him from consideration. By the spring of 1998, with no physical evidence and no credible lead, the case went cold. Molly Dreiser had been missing for 6 months. She was still 7 years old in the photograph that remained on the sheriff's bulletin board, gap-toothed and smiling in her purple sweatshirt, and she would remain 7 years old there for a very long time. By the summer of 1999, 20 months after Molly vanished, the Dreisers had moved. The house on County Road 400 North was listed for sale in April and sold in June to a retired couple from Frankfurt who planted a flower bed along the fence where Diane's garden had been and did not know, or perhaps did not want to know, what the property held. Gary and Diane relocated to a rental house in Lafayette, 26 miles south. Gary found work at a distribution center. Diane took a year away from teaching. She would say later, in court documents, that she could not look at second graders without seeing Molly's face in each of them, could not read aloud to a classroom without hearing the echo of a voice that was no longer there to answer. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, the specific, corrosive experience of holding a suspicion you cannot prove and cannot bring yourself to name, what happened inside the Dreiser marriage in those years may be recognizable. It is the slow geography of a house where certain rooms are never entered, where certain hours of certain days carry a particular weight, where 2 people share meals and sleep and chores and manage, most of the time, not to look at each other in exactly the right way that would require one of them to say the thing that cannot be unsaid. Diane Dreiser began keeping a journal in the winter of 1998. She had never kept one before. She wrote in it at night, after Gary fell asleep, at the kitchen table under the low light of the range hood. Portions of this journal would be entered into evidence in 2019. What it contains, in the careful handwriting of a second-grade teacher who chose her words precisely, is a record of a woman assembling, piece by piece, a picture she did not want to see. She wrote about the odometer. She had heard about the mileage discrepancy through the Carroll County grapevine. A detective's wife had mentioned it obliquely at a church supper, and the number had lodged in Diane's mind like a splinter. She wrote that she had gone through the previous year's receipts and found 2 cash withdrawals from their joint account, one for $60 in September, one for $40 in early October, neither of which Gary had mentioned, and for which she had found no corresponding purchase. She wrote about a Tuesday night in February of 1998, 4 months after Molly disappeared, when she woke at 2 in the morning to find Gary standing at the window of their bedroom, looking out at nothing, the dark yard of the rental house, a streetlight, the flat midwinter silence. And when she asked him what he was doing, he said, without turning around, "I'm just thinking about that window." She did not ask which window. She already knew. She wrote in January of 1999 about a drawing she found in the pocket of Gary's work jacket while sorting laundry. It was on a scrap of notebook paper, a rough sketch in pencil of what appeared to be a floor plan, a rectangle with interior walls, a small square in one corner that could have been a room. She stared at it for a long time, she wrote. Then she put it back. Clears throat. If you have ever noticed how quickly a marriage can stop being a marriage and become instead an arrangement between two people who no longer know how to leave, you may recognize what the Dreiser household had become by the turn of the century. They shared the rental in Lafayette for another 3 years. They ate dinner at the same table. They attended the annual vigils that the Carroll County community organized on each October 14th. Standing side by side in the cold with candles, and the careful silence of people who had run out of things to say. In the autumn of 2001, Diane Dreiser asked Gary to move out. She told him only that she needed to be alone. She did not say the other thing. Not yet. She was not ready, and she was not certain, and she had been living for 4 years with the kind of knowledge that feels like accusation without evidence, the worst kind, because it poisons everything and proves nothing. Gary moved into an apartment in West Lafayette. He took the truck, a box of books, and the photograph of Molly from the mantelpiece. He left the garden tools, a box of winter clothes, and on the kitchen table a note that said only, "I'm sorry." Diane kept the note. She kept everything, and she continued writing in her journal, alone at the kitchen table at night, working towards something she did not yet have words for. Detective Raymond Ellsworth retired from the Carroll County Sheriff's Department in 2004. Before he left, he transferred the Dreiser case file, 7 binders and 2 evidence boxes, to a younger detective named Carla Whitten, 32, who had joined the department 3 years earlier with a background in forensic accounting, and a dogged quality her colleagues alternately admired and found exhausting. Ellsworth said to her, on the day he handed over the boxes, "Don't let it go cold forever." Whitten said she wouldn't, she meant it. For the next 14 years, the case slept in its boxes. Whitten returned to it every 6 months, reviewed the evidence log, checked whether any new forensic technology might be applicable, re-interviewed witnesses when life events brought them back into the orbit of the investigation. She interviewed Diane Dreiser twice in those years. She noted in her case file, both times, that Diane was cooperative, composed, and that she seemed to be choosing her words very carefully. In her private case notes, which would later become part of the prosecution's file, Whitten wrote, "She knows something. She's not ready." She was right on both counts. The call that reopened the case came on a Wednesday morning in March of 2019. It came not from a forensic laboratory, not from a newly surfaced witness, and not from any of the channels that investigators had kept quietly open for 21 years. It came from a woman named Bate Calloway, 43, a social worker in Tippecanoe County, who had spent the previous 14 months in a process she described to Detective Whitten as getting ready to tell the truth. Bate Calloway had been Gary Dreiser's girlfriend in the autumn of 1997. She had been 21 years old. She told Whitten in a recorded interview that ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, deeply afraid of Gary Dreiser. Not of anything he had done to her directly, but of what she knew and what she had seen and what she had been told in terms that she understood as a warning, never to repeat. She said, "He told me in August of that year that he needed to make some changes, that he had a plan. I didn't understand what he meant. I didn't want to understand." She told investigators that on the night of October 13, 1997, Gary had driven to her apartment in Frankfurt, 43 miles from the Dreiser property, at approximately midnight. She said he arrived agitated and left within 20 minutes. She said he told her that something had happened and that she should not contact him. She said that when she saw 2 days later that a child had gone missing from his home, she understood immediately what he had meant. And she said she had spent 21 years carrying that knowledge like a stone in her chest, until the weight of it finally became greater than her fear. Clears throat. The 43-mile drive from the Dreiser property to Calloway's apartment in Frankfurt and back, 86 miles, round trip, plus the additional miles Witten was already reconstructing, a route that, with additional stops, could account for a significant portion of the unexplained odometer reading investigators had photographed on October 15th. They were not the full 300 miles, but they were the beginning of an answer. Witten and her partner, Detective James Ohl of the Indiana State Police, began the formal reinvestigation on March 11, 2019. Over the following 8 weeks they re-examined 22 years of case materials, re-interviewed 9 witnesses, and used advances in digital forensics to reconstruct the call log of a prepaid phone that had been purchased, according to a receipt in Gary Dreiser's name, found in the bottom of the second evidence box, from a gas station in Rossville on October 2, 1997, 12 days before Molly vanished. The prepaid phone had been turned over by Gary voluntarily in November of 1997, listed in his inventory of personal property. It had been logged and shelved. In 1997, forensic capabilities for recovering data from prepaid devices were essentially non-existent for small county departments. In 2019, they were not. The phone contained 11 outgoing calls over 12 days to 3 different numbers. 2 of the numbers were disconnected. The third belonged to a storage facility in Carroll County, 14 miles east of the Dreiser property, on a rural route accessible from a county road that intersected, at its far end, with a creek bed that Carroll County dive teams had searched in October of 1997, but had not fully documented on the eastern bank, where the water ran shallow and the vegetation was dense. On April 29, 2019, a forensic team returned to that creek bed with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The Carroll County coroner was present. Detective Witten was present. It was a clear morning, cold still, the kind of Indiana spring that keeps apologizing for winter. At 11:42 a.m., the radar equipment returned an anomaly in a section of elevated bank 14 feet from the waterline. Excavation began at 1:15 p.m. and concluded at 4:07 p.m. What was recovered that afternoon was conveyed to the Indiana State Police Laboratory in Indianapolis for forensic analysis. The results of that analysis, returned on May 14, 2019, confirmed the identity of the remains through dental records that had been on file with the Carroll County Sheriff's Department since October 1997. Molly Ann Dreiser had been found. She had been in that creek bank for 21 years and 7 months. She was still, in every way that mattered, 7 years old. The arrest of Gary Michael Dreiser occurred on the morning of May 22, 2019, at the apartment complex in West Lafayette where he had lived, following his separation from Diane, since 2001. He was 56 years old. He had been employed for the past 11 years as a maintenance supervisor at a commercial property management firm. He had remarried in 2007. A woman named Patricia, who worked as a dental hygienist and who, by all accounts, had no knowledge of the past her husband carried. Detectives Witten and Ohill, accompanied by 4 Indiana State Police officers, arrived at Gary Dreiser's apartment at 7:14 a.m. He answered the door in work clothes. He looked at Witten for a long moment before she spoke. Those present would later describe his expression not as surprise, not as fear, but as something more complicated. The expression, one detective said in a later deposition, of a man who has been waiting for a knock on a particular door for a very long time and is, in some way he can't entirely explain, almost relieved to finally hear it. He did not resist. He did not speak. He placed his hands where he was told to place them, and he was taken out of the apartment and into the gray May morning without looking back. The news broke across Carroll County by noon. By evening it had traveled to every corner of the state. The Carroll County Banner, which had run Molly's photograph above the fold for 2 weeks in October of 1997, ran a new front page. A copy of the original photograph beside the booking photograph of her father, the 2 images side by side in the particular cruelty of juxtaposition that truth sometimes requires. The community's response was not singular. There were those who said they had always known, who replayed the composed face in the command tent, the hands in the pockets at the back field, the 2 cups of coffee on the morning his daughter was missing, and felt vindicated in a grief that had no satisfying name. And there were those who wept not for what had been discovered, but for what the discovery meant about the years they had spent believing in Gary Dreiser's innocence, offering him casseroles at vigils, standing beside him in October cold with candles, mourning alongside a man who was not mourning at all. Diane Dreiser released a written statement through her attorney on May 23, 2019. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence thanked the investigators who had never let the case rest completely. The second sentence said that she had spent 22 years hoping she was wrong. The third sentence said that she had known, on some level that she had not had the courage to name, since the morning she watched her husband stand at the back field with his hands in his pockets, not searching, just watching, that she was not wrong. She did not give press interviews. She did not appear at the preliminary hearing. She continued to write in her journal, which she had now been keeping for 21 years, one of the longest sustained private records of a truth in the process of becoming known that the Carroll County prosecution team said they had ever encountered. Clears throat. Gary Michael Dreiser entered a guilty plea in Carroll County Superior Court on February 3, 2020, to 1 count of felony homicide in the first degree. He was sentenced on March 12, 2020, to 55 years in the Indiana Department of Correction, with no possibility of conditional release before the age of 111. In practical terms, the judge noted at sentencing, this was a life sentence. He did not allocute. He stood before the bench and he accepted the sentence and he sat down. Patricia, his second wife, was not present. Bate Calloway sat in the 3rd row of the gallery. Diane Dreiser sat in the 1st row, directly behind the prosecution table. She wore a blue cardigan and she held a small photograph in her lap, not the gap-toothed school picture that had appeared in every newspaper for 22 years, but a different one. A photograph she had taken herself on a Saturday in August of 1997, 7 weeks before everything changed. Molly on the swing set in mid-arc, arms out, head back, entirely airborne, laughing at something that no one else in the photograph could see. The swing hung still. The toy truck lay on its side. And in the packed, silent gallery of a Carroll County courtroom in the 2nd week of March in 2020, a woman in a blue cardigan pressed a photograph to her chest and waited for the judge to finish speaking. There is a particular category of case that challenges everything we think we know about the people we share our lives with, that asks us to hold simultaneously the knowledge that someone was loved, was trusted, was part of the daily texture of a world, and the knowledge of what that same person was capable of in the hours when no one was watching. The Dreiser case is that kind of case. Not because it is spectacular. It is not. It is quiet and rural and almost unbearably ordinary in its geography, in its details, in the specific texture of the life that surrounded it. It matters because Molly Dreiser was 7 years old and she liked strawberry jam on white toast, and she always woke before everyone else, and she was entitled to a world that protected her, and it did not. It matters because Diane Dreiser spent 22 years writing the truth in the small hours of the night, assembling it piece by piece in a journal no one was supposed to read, until the accumulation of it finally became too heavy to carry alone. It matters because Detective Raymond Ellsworth handed over 7 binders and 2 evidence boxes and said, "Don't let it go cold forever." And a younger detective took those boxes home and returned to them every 6 months for 14 years, and meant what she said when she promised she wouldn't. Cases go cold. They do not have to stay that way. Molly Ann Dreiser, October 14, 1990 to October 13, 1997. Remembered not in the language of tragedy but in the language of a life that was genuinely, wholly, entirely hers, brown braids, a gap-toothed smile, a swing set in the last warm evenings of an Indiana summer, and a laugh that belonged to no one else. Justice is not restoration. It does not give back what was taken, but it is, in the end, the only honest thing we know how to offer to the people who are no longer here to speak for themselves.